Hello, everybody. My name is Jacek Bartosiak. Welcome to Strategy and Future. Today is our friend Nicholas Myers. Hi, Nick. How are you?
Hello, Jacek. I'm back in Scotland for at least a couple more days. I have my own brew with me. Sorry, the lighting is always as terrible wherever I am.
Okay, cool. A short trip to Europe from US in the middle of the mutiny in Russia, and let's get started with this mutiny. We are recording our conversation on the 27th of June, late evening, 2023. It's critically important to know the date, since the speed of events these days can surprise everybody. So, what is your assessment of the situation? Why do we call it a mutiny? How frail Russia is and the Russian political system? What is your take on it?
So I don't want to dwell too much on the literal events that occurred simply because in the unclassified sphere, the number of events that we have are quite few and far between. Before I go any further, I'm not going to talk about any classified information, and my views don't reflect that of the United States government, the United States Naval War College, or the Department of the Navy, or anything of that.
Yeah.
What we do know is that when the mutiny began, and if we can call it safely a mutiny because there were forces that had previously been more or less within the chain of command of the Russian war effort that were departing it and indeed turning their arms against that authority. When the mutiny began, there was quite a bit of planning about how to get it started. So they were able to seize a decent amount of territory and assets relatively fast. Some of it was just long and thin, so like seizing a rail line or a series of road links going north towards Moscow. Though now, obviously, getting quite to it. But as they start to take control of places, including Rostov-na-Don, the 10th largest city in the entire Russian Federation, we didn't see much protest in favor of the legitimate government of Russia. We did see some resistance to the fact that mercenaries were taking over the town, but broadly, the main thing we saw was a combination of apathy and people trying to evacuate from the city because of instability going on. And Rostov-na-Don is important because this is still the major center where the Russian special military operation against Ukraine is being managed from. So Shoigu and Gerasimov are regularly visiting there. I know there was some speculation that I haven't seen fully confirmed that they were in town as the whole thing started and had to escape. But there's so many details about this that we really don't know the truth of that it's hard to rule on those things. But I think we must think very clearly here that there is practically no depth to the Putin regime's support within the Russian Federation at this point. There are plenty of people who don't want to protest or don't want to do anything against it, or are more or less just apathetic about its existence. But there are practically no major supporters that are ready to get out in the street in a way that other countries, when they have coup attempts or mutinies within the military, can mobilize the population to shut this down. Like most famously, Erdogan mobilizing the Turkish population to stop the coup that was at first appearing to succeed in 2016. So that, I think, is the most important takeaway that we need to take out a couple of days after this abortive attempt to take out the Ministry of Defense leadership, we're told.
Sure, but that's the beginning, only the beginning of the story and the beginning of the implications. So, what do you think about broader implications? I would be very much interested in your opinion whether the United States government was happy to see the events unfolding in such a escalatory way that destabilized the sort of the controllable escalation process and the sort of fighting process in Ukraine. So, from the perspective of a great power that always is very cautious not to touch upon the sensitive things in order to avoid escalation, that must have been scary for the DC folks, huh?
It is an important point, and one of the notable things during the events on Saturday was how certain Western representatives, the one that is seeing the most prominently, the British ambassador in Moscow, sending out information that clearly was designed to stoke defeatism in the Russian military, claiming that Wagner Group commanded far more of a proportion of Russian troops than is true. Honestly, the number one thing that I have noticed in the retired community of U.S. government, as opposed to currently active students. I honestly haven't been in the office. I've been out of town on leave travel during the course of this. Has been just genuine terror at, is the Russian Federation actually about to start to melt into a civil war, which we need to start looking for these nuclear weapons? Now, among the U.S. government retired community, this was, of course, the main scenario that they had been fearing in the early 90s. Which infamously led to almost no planning for what to do when there was a lesser crisis, such as Yugoslavia erupting. Everybody was planning for what if the Soviet Union starts to dissolve into conflict left, right, and center, as was already apparent in Nagorno-Karabakh, as well as Tajikistan, and then threatening to do so in the Baltic states. So it does raise very, very serious concerns about what would be needed to do in order to make sure that a frail Russia in which we're approaching a state failure situation could be upheld. Now, at where we're sitting right now, I don't think we are looking at a place where I don't think we're living in a world in which the Russian Federation is going to collapse in the next couple of days. I don't even think Putin's going to be gone in the next couple of days or weeks. I think it's much more a question of months and years, but a single-digit quantity of years. I don't think anybody should be seriously thinking about Putin lasting till 2038 or whenever his terms would get him to if he keeps running for re-election. We were discussing on our own private chats of the past couple of days. This looks a lot more like the Kornilov affair than anything else. In more recent
1917, yes.
1917 at the midpoint, which was primarily launched by people who thought they could run the war better than the provisional government in Petrograd could. And that is what's happening here, is that the initial resistance to the Putin regime that is emerging are from people who believe in the war, who believe in basically the same principles that Putin does, which is essentially the imperial notion of what Russia is, but believe that the Putin regime is doing an incompetent job of it and they could do it better, and are tired of Putin being in the way. And Putin and some of his main people, such as Shoigu and Gerasimov, most prominently, being in the way of more competent leadership. That doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be the force that's most powerful within Russia as things fragment, but what it does mean is that I think the dissident forces in Russia are now going to be thinking a lot more about organizing than they are about protesting. And this is going to be a major problem. We now know that if Putin is put into a position where he perceives that his power is being directly challenged and that the forces are coming remarkably close to Moscow, like the last absolutely confirmed place that the Wagner Group got to, and this was 4 hours before he called off the mutiny, was at the rail line between Lipetsk and Oryol, which you can look at a map. It's no longer a border region of Russia. It's about halfway between the northeastern Ukrainian border and Moscow. And infamously, Oryol was the last city that the White Russian uprising coming from the south got to before everything started to fall apart for them as the Bolsheviks fought back over the following year. So if Putin is put into that situation, what he does is he makes concessions. There are plenty of people who protested on the streets of Moscow from basically Prigozhin's standpoint who are now in jail for being more patriotic than the government is. And Prigozhin's now living in Belarus, pretty much, though there will be constraints upon his lifestyle in the future. I don't think he's going to see serious consequences. And he still seems to have at least some leverage for.
Do you think that he will bring over his companions from the Wagner Group, and it will be like PLO, the Arafat's, the organization that settled in Jordan first. Then it was evicted from Jordan. Then it settled in southern Lebanon, destabilized Lebanon. The Israelis had to, intervene. Do you think that the probably a similar scenario might unfold in Belarus and in this way imperil the Polish peaceful, sort of existence?
It is possible, but I think Lukashenko is actually smarter and has more resources available than that. Part of this is simply because the Belarusians now control a fair quantity of leverage points against the Russians relative to before the war. So a lot of the best training mechanisms that the Russian military still has are to go to Belarus, where the NCOs weren't killed last year. Belarusians now, of course, have tactical nuclear weapons, which of course means that if Russia starts to fragment, Lukashenko could just seize them. And what exactly are they going to do about it? And this adds to the pressure of if the Lukashenko regime is actually as fragile as the Russian one is, and we saw plenty of evidence over 2020 to 2021 that it was, that those same problems are also now going to apply within that country. So I think we are entering a period in which we are going to see regime influence shrinking back towards the capitals, almost in a medieval sense. I don't think this is going to happen overnight. I do think that this is going to take at least several months to play out, and it's going to require more people to raise initiative in the way that Prigozhin did in order for things to actually fragment. I do expect, however, that Putin understands this process, and he's going to be looking for any mechanism he can to make the Russian Federation seem like more of a state than just his personal fiefdom. So, in my opinion, this drastically increases the chance that he's going to at least name some caretaker to be the presidential candidate next year. I don't think that that's going to diminish his informal power over the state. In fact, I think it's probably going to just transform to something much closer to what he would ideally like to be doing now, which is weigh in whenever he wants to and take longer vacations between events. But again, while that's going to make it easier for him to point to Russia has some sort of continuity of government and legal system, is it actually going to motivate Russians to believe harder in what his government is attempting to do? And there, I really don't know which direction we're going in. The forces that we do know exist within Russia that we should be watching first and foremost are the imperial faction, which I think is mostly I think they're going to strike first and lose here. I think Prigozhin's probably the most powerful element of this. The others that tend to voice these things, people like Strelkov or Igor Girkin, they don't really have an army to follow them anymore because they lost the one that they tried to get. But they're the ones that I think are the most ready to go because the government for the longest time has done the least to oppress them. The one that the government has done the most to oppress are the actual ethnic Russian nationalists, which I think they could organize more effectively than you would think. And they would be, I think a lot of them did join the army out of some sense of putting the Ukrainians down. And so they have better military training these days. They do need to find each other within the units, which again is going to take probably a year or two at minimum for any degree of organization to emerge. But if they start to come up with, Decembrist is the wrong term because the Decembrists are coming from the opposite perspective, but a Decembrist style of organization against the state, but for the opposite perspective, it could be done. We know that the Decembrists needed something like 9 odd years to organize, and that they still went ahead of the time. Obviously, communications aren't as good in the early 19th century, but similar type of dynamic. The one that everybody wants to have win is the liberals. Trouble, and the good news of that is that they are concentrated in Moscow and St. Petersburg, which is obviously the strategically most important part of Russia. But a lot of them are now either demoralized by just how much the state is not responding to anything whatsoever, arrested all the people who were originally motivated to go out and protest when the war broke out. And I think they also have some degree of greater moral antipathy towards causing a civil war, which is going to invariably lead to a lot of death. So they are a faction that we should be aware of, but it's not one that I think is going to be especially prominent at the beginning. We can all hope that they win in the end. And maybe by not striking first they could, but I'm not sure. And then finally, we just need to remember all the different national groups and not national minority groups across Russia. I mean, everybody knows about the Chechens, but the Chechens aren't the most important ones. If anything, Kadyrov has been quite competent at knowing when to lower his head and keep himself within the Russian Federation system. Now, the Russian Federation starts crumbling around him, anything goes, and he might decide that this is a time for quite a lot of change. But part of the reason why this mutiny occurred when it did was that the Russian Ministry of Defense was cracking down on the Akhmat Group and Wagner Group, saying that they had to sign some form of contract to join into the formal Russian military. And the Akhmat Group, which is Kadyrov's PMC, accepted, and Prigozhin in his resistance came up with this plan. Whether or not it was a serious plan to take out Shoigu or whether it was just a means of making a statement, I really don't know, but this is what caused it originally.
And what do you think? What are the implications for Poland in terms of the this instability that you envision in the East? This sort of the withdrawal towards the cities and capital cities, and basically the maybe anarchic system that might sort of resemble the situation after post 1917 in the East, and after 1918, after the Brest-Litovsk agreement, when everybody was fighting everybody. Actually, nobody knew the enemy, a foe, and a friend, and there was this vacuum of power.
So, similar to in 1917 to 1920, 21, part of the difficulty in understanding where to draw a line in the Kresy regions on the outskirts of what the Poles thought of Poland and what today we now think of as large parts of Belarus, Lithuania, and Ukraine, is that the population density was quite low. And these days, in a post-Soviet world, the urbanization rate is much higher. So a lot of this is going to be defined by the cities themselves. That said, if we happen to know that like the Belarusian state and the Russian state are just incredibly fragile and anything might happen, then we need to be prepared for what happens to the stuff outside of those cities. The difficulty that's going to hit everybody is that the main crisis is going to be an urban one of nobody knowing who's in charge of a particular city, maybe forces ranging from organized crime to specific localist elites, or localist demagogues, or anything are taking over specific areas. And there's going to be a feeling that we should intervene in order to restore order to these places. I would warn that I think exactly that mindset was what trapped the Russian military into doing its absolutely stupid plan to invade Ukraine in February 2022, in which they assumed that the center of gravity was just taking control of the population centers as fast as possible, thinking that as soon as they had them, they could isolate the Ukrainian military from the people, and then without resources, they would just give up pretty quickly. I don't think that in these areas there's going to be a large degree of sympathy for joining a successful country that's not their own. I do think that there is going to be a lot of room for Poland to be magnanimous in welcoming cities that are willing to align with the opposition government of Belarus, or even just be opposed to Lukashenko and offering a way towards talking about joining the European Union or some sort of other means of greater intercourse with the West. So it's going to be a difficult line to draw. I don't think a military response is going to be the most appropriate way to do this in the places that are going to be most prominent in the news. Where they will be appropriate is what's going to happen to a lot of these bases that are generally on the outskirts of these cities. Though the quantity of conventional munitions has greatly decreased over the course of this war, we are talking about a place where there's a lot of sophisticated equipment out there, including now tactical nuclear weapons, at least in a couple of days, if the plan to send them to Belarus is accurate. As Putin described it to Lukashenko a couple of weeks ago anyway. And we are going to want to be able to secure those things before unsavory forces get a hold of them. And what's worse, I think it's going to be better if the Belarusian and Russian governments retained control of them in the short term, which might even mean us assisting in getting them to the few places they still control.
Mm-hmm.
Again, we're now going into deep speculation here.
Yeah.
Too far ahead of ourselves. This is still some time in the future, but I think we now need to be seriously planning for what the world looks like if the Russian and Belarusian states begin to implode. Hopefully not into civil war, but possibly into one. And that is something that also to maintain. It's not necessarily going when the Russian state begins to fragment. If this trend continues, it's not so much that there's going to be more Prigozhins out there that somebody say, "Arise, all my people," and they take over various parts of the country. It could very well just turn into no one cares what's going on in Moscow anymore. So Novosibirsk decides to elect some independence-minded person who may be a liberal, may be a communist, for all we know. I think. That fortunately is more likely than all-out 1918 to 1924 style civil war, but it's still one of those things. It's going to be a spectrum.
Yeah.
But here's my prediction I made with you shortly after the war started, that it is going to be a 5 to 7 year process between February 2022 and whenever the guns stop being fired at large quantities.
Well, we'll see how it develops. We will see. Next time, I promised myself that I will talk to you about the U.S.-China thing and what will the year 2024 will bring, given the elections in Taiwan and the elections in the U.S. and this sort of cascading destabilization of the relationship with those two big events, where unpredictability of new characters on the scene might also usher in even more dynamic escalation of untrust, distrust, and lack of equilibrium. In this, even in the fragile relationship, you always seek some equilibrium. You even if you compete, you want to do it within some frames. So some predictability, some sort of the procedures, how you do it, some sort of getting to know each other is critically important. And what happens if Kuomintang wins the elections in Taiwan and they secretly start negotiating with mainland China because they don't want to repeat the fate of Ukraine? And of course, there's a reunification plan that would last 30 years, but still that would jeopardize the U.S. position in the Western Pacific, in a big way, and that might destabilize the relationship that is already very fragile and even fragmented, so to speak, fractured. So, but I promise, Nick, that we'll talk about it next time. What do you think?
I'd be happy to do that.
I'm just giving you a hint what I wanted to ask you about. I even wrote a piece today about it because I read this Prigozhin thing, this Prigozhin mutiny, illuminated me how sometimes unexpected events that changes the perceptions of both parties and stability of even a very fractured relationship that might, end up in war is critically important. And sometimes such events may really destabilize even the frail equilibrium. And this is what I fear from 2024 in the Western Pacific. We'll see. We'll see. Trump was known for openly destabilizing the situation, openly acting in an unpredictable way This is, by the way, the privilege of a stronger party. And Trump was thinking the United States is strongest by far. And if you're stronger in a relationship, you can act unpredictably. But if it's only your perception, so the other party is trying to check your bluff, and that's ushers in a highly escalatory conditioning upon both parties, and this is what I fear. And I would like to understand this process just to get ready and to understand the behaviors of the parties. So that's my 5 cents, and then let's talk about next time, Nick. Okay.
Well, fortunately for you, Poland might be the stronger partner when you're talking about facing off with Belarus in the very near future, anyhow.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you very much, Nick. Our guest today was Nicholas Myers, this time around from Scotland, not from Rhode Island. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you.
Yeah, take care.